And welcome to another power-packed Phillips podcast. We continue our epic, huge, Caroline, huge series on gridding for the FCAT because we don't want you to be like this. Just take a look at the picture right here. Now let's see what they have below. Nice. In our last podcast, we talked about repeating decimals and how to grid in repeating decimals. There's also something called terminating decimals, like the movie The Terminator. I'll be back. Excellent movie. We've completed the first row of grids. In our last podcast, we did the first 3 grids in the second row. If you are absent, please see the crazy math teacher, and he'll either write you a pass to come back later today to make up the work we did in these 3 grids, or you can take your packet home and you can do it at home. The podcast has been posted in Blackboard under gridding decimals. Since we addressed how to grid in repeating decimals in the last podcast, you got it. In today's podcast, we're going to address how to grid in terminating decimals. If you ever have any questions regarding skydiving, then that's right. Make sure you ask Mr. Peters because he's done it before. Because, you know, to the crazy math teacher, it makes perfect sense and it's very logical that someone would jump out of a perfectly fine airplane and plummet towards the ground at a high velocity. Yeah, makes sense to me. But anyways, I digress. The point of this picture is to let you know that when you go skydiving, you should always have 2 chutes. The first chute is the one that you pull, and the second chute is known as your backup chute, in case something goes wrong with the first chute. Well, on the FCAT, you have a backup chute, and here's your backup chute. There's a section in your FCAT question book that shows you how to fill in the grids. So what I'm telling you is, just like you have a backup chute if you ever go skydiving, when you get to the FCAT in a couple weeks, use your backup chute, which is the section in your FCAT book that shows you how to fill in the grids. Where is it located at? You're going to have 2 things for the FCAT. You're going to have your question book with all the questions in it, and then you're going to have your answer sheet that you grid in and you fill in the multiple choice questions. In your question book, where all the questions are for your FCAT, there will be a section towards the front of it where they give you examples of how to grid in answers for the FCAT. So make sure that you remember, if you forget how to do the grids on the FCAT, use your backup chute. Use that section in your FCAT question book towards the front that shows you how to grid in the answers. All right, for today's podcast, we're going to use the second row of grids. We've already done the first 3. We're going to do the last 2 grids in the second row today. All right, guys. If you had a terminating decimal, a decimal that comes to an end or stops on the FCAT, such as 0.875, you have 2 choices on how you can grid it in. So the most obvious way would be to put in a 0 placeholder, the decimal point, the 875, then you would just bubble in the corresponding decimal and the corresponding numbers. That is your first choice. As many of you realized in our last podcast last week, you do not have to put that placeholder if it's a 0. So the other way that you could grid in your answer would be to put the decimal and then the 875, grid in a decimal, and then bubble in the 875. So your choice, you can either put the 0 here and then put the decimal right here and then 875, or you can grid it in like this. Your choice, pick one of the 2 ways, and please do it on your paper now. And we'll practice one more if you had a terminating decimal on the FCAT like 0.59. Again, 2 choices when you grid it, just like the last one. You could either put in 0 decimal point 59, or you don't have to put the 0 in for the placeholder. You could just put in 0.59. Both answers are acceptable. Both answers are equivalent. So you should have the last two grids in the second row filled in now. Your choice of either with a placeholder of a 0 or no placeholder of a 0. All right, guys, that's going to conclude this podcast. Please make sure that you either, one, exit the video app and your podcast will rewind for you automatically, or you can rewind the podcast yourself. iPod goes back to the case. FCAT review packet goes back on the counter. Thank you. Later.